The dinner party at the lakeside penthouse was a masterpiece of suburban perfection, from the vintage Pinot Noir to the effortless laughter echoing off the marble walls. But when Lucas caught the reflection in the patio glass, his wife's hand lingering a second too long on his best friend's lower back, the illusion didn't just crack. It disintegrated into a million silent shards. Some betrayals don't start with a scream, but with a quiet, suffocating realization that the life you built is a lie. If you want to see how a man calculates the price of his dignity and plans an escape that will echo for decades, stay with me, because the real storm is just gathering. The notification on Elena's phone lit up the dark mahogany of the kitchen island, a silent flare in the dim ambiance of their Chicago penthouse. It was 11:42 p.m. Lucas didn't mean to look. He was merely reaching for his glass of water, the ice cubes clinking softly against the crystal. The screen buzzed once, displaying a snippet of a message from M. Legal. Thinking about the velvet dress. Don't sleep yet. Lucas froze. His hand hovered over the countertop, the cold from the marble seeping into his fingertips. M. Legal was the contact name for Mark, his best friend since law school, the man who had stood as his best man, the man who was currently asleep in the guest room down the hall because his own apartment was being fumigated. Or so he had said. From the master bedroom upstairs, the faint sound of the shower running ceased. Lucas stared at the phone until the screen went black, swallowing the secret back into the digital void. He didn't scream. He didn't storm down the hallway to drag Mark out of bed by his collar. Instead, a terrifying glacial calm washed over him. It was the same detached precision he used when inspecting the structural integrity of a failing building. He assessed the damage, calculated the risk, and realized the foundation was already gone. Lucas walked to the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over Lake Michigan. The city lights shimmered on the black water, beautiful and indifferent. Behind him, he heard Elena's footsteps on the stairs. She smelled of lavender and something sharper, anticipation. Lucas? Her voice was soft, practiced. Why are you still up? He turned slowly. She was wearing the silk robe he had bought her for their 10th anniversary, her hair damp and clinging to her neck. She looked at the phone on the counter, then at him. A micro-expression flickered across her face. Panic, instantly masked by a weary smile. Just work, Lucas lied, his voice steady, devoid of the tremor wrecking his chest. Thinking about the chaotic zoning laws for the new West Loop project. Elena exhaled, her shoulders dropping. She walked past him to get a glass of water, her hand brushing his arm. It was a casual, intimate gesture that used to ground him. Now, it felt like a brand. As she leaned against the counter, right next to the phone, she tapped the screen casually, checking the time, checking him. You work too hard, Luke, she murmured, her eyes drifting toward the guest room hallway for a fraction of a second. Mark said you looked exhausted at dinner tonight. Did he? Lucas took a sip of water, tasting nothing. Mark is very observant. He cares about us, about you, she corrected quickly. I know. Lucas set his glass down. The sound was too loud in the quiet kitchen. I'm going to check on the kids. They're asleep, honey. I know. I just need to see them. Lucas walked past her, past the lies standing in his kitchen, and climbed the stairs to the second floor. He entered Leo's room first, then Sophie's. He watched their chests rise and fall in the rhythm of innocent sleep. The anger that had been threatening to boil over suddenly cooled into a hard resolve. He wasn't going to fight for Elena. You don't fight for something that has already been sold. He looked at Sophie's packed school bag and Leo's Lego set scattered on the rug. "I am not losing you too," he promised silently in the dark. "Not to this." He went back to the master bedroom. Elena was already in bed, feigning sleep, her phone face down on the nightstand. Lucas lay down beside her, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic breathing of a stranger. In his mind, he was already packing boxes. He was already booking tickets. He was already gone. The office of Arthur Vance was situated on the 45th floor of a steel glass tower on Wacker Drive, offering a view of the city that made everything look like a toy set. It was clinical, cold, and expensive. Exactly what Lucas needed. "Infidelity isn't enough to guarantee you full custody in Illinois, Lucas," Vance said, sliding a thick manila folder across the polished ebony desk. He was a man who spoke in billable hours, concise and devoid of pity. "Unless we can prove the environment is toxic for the children, or that there is a flight risk, you need leverage. Brutal leverage." Lucas sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap. He hadn't slept in 3 days, but his mind was operating with a frightening, feverish clarity. "I have the financial records," Lucas said, his voice flat. "Elena has been siphoning joint savings into a separate account under her maiden name. And Mark? Mark has been using company cards to fund their hotel stays. That's embezzlement, Arthur. That's leverage." Vance paused, raising an eyebrow. A flicker of respect passed through his guarded eyes. "That changes the landscape. If you expose Mark, you destroy his career. If you expose Elena's complicity, you paint her as unstable and reckless." "I don't care about their careers," Lucas replied, standing up and smoothing out his suit jacket. "I just want Sophie and Leo. Draw up the papers, but don't file them yet. I need 2 weeks. 2 weeks? To build the exit." 3 nights later, the charade reached its peak. The dining room was filled with the warm, savory scent of roasted rosemary chicken. It was a domestic tableau that could have been featured in a lifestyle magazine. Elena was laughing at something Mark said, her head thrown back, exposing the long line of her throat. Mark sat at the head of the table, Lucas's seat, pouring a vintage Cabernet with the ease of a man who felt he owned the place. Lucas sat opposite them, dissecting his chicken with surgical precision. He watched them. He watched how Mark's foot brushed against Elena's calf under the table. He watched the secret, heavy glances they exchanged when they thought he was focused on his meal. It was nauseating, yet fascinating, like watching a slow-motion car crash. "So, Lucas," Mark said, swirling his wine, his tone laced with that familiar, brotherly affection that now sounded like a snake hissing. "Elena tells me you're planning a trip? A site visit?" Lucas didn't look up immediately. He chewed slowly, swallowed, and then raised his eyes. He let his gaze linger on Mark's face for a second too long, just enough to make Mark's smile falter slightly. "Yes," Lucas lied smoothly. "A potential project in Seattle. High-end residential. I might be gone for a few days next week to scout the location. I was thinking of taking the kids. Turn it into a mini vacation before their summer camp starts." Elena froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Taking the kids? To Seattle? Lucas, they have school." "It's just 2 days, Elle. They're ahead in their classes. Besides," Lucas looked at her, infusing his voice with a feigned exhaustion, "you've been so stressed lately with the gallery opening. I thought you might appreciate the quiet house. A little time to yourself." He saw it then, the spark in her eyes. It wasn't relief. It was opportunity. She looked at Mark, a quick darting glance. If Lucas and the kids were gone, They would have the penthouse, the city, and the nights entirely to themselves. No sneaking around, no hushed whispers. That actually sounds thoughtful, Elena said slowly, trying to suppress the eagerness in her voice. You're right. The gallery is overwhelming right now. I think it's a great idea, Mark chimed in too quickly. Lucas is right. You need a break, Elena, and the kids would love the Space Needle. Lucas smiled. It was a tight, thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. They had taken the bait. They were so blinded by their lust and the thrill of their secret that they didn't see the trap closing around them. They thought he was giving them space. In reality, he was clearing the blast zone. Then it's settled, Lucas said, raising his glass. To quiet weekends. To quiet weekends, Mark echoed, clinking his glass against Lucas's. The crystal rang out, a clear, sharp sound that felt like a bell tolling for a funeral. Lucas drank the wine, savoring the bitter aftertaste. He wasn't just planning a trip. He was planning an abduction of his own life. The suitcases were already in the trunk of the SUV. Lucas had packed them systematically while Elena was at the gallery, labeling the act as efficiency for their upcoming trip. Now, standing in the foyer of the penthouse for the last time, he felt a strange lack of sentimentality. He looked at the high ceilings, the custom art pieces, the life he had curated for 15 years. It felt like walking through a museum exhibit that was about to be closed down. Dad? Are we going to miss the flight? Sophie's voice cut through the silence. She was standing by the elevator, her headphones around her neck, looking at him with the sharp intuition of a teenager who senses a shift in the wind. No, Soph. We're right on time, Lucas said, checking his watch. It was 10 a.m. Elena wouldn't be back until 6 p.m., or so he thought. He had plenty of time, but the air in the apartment felt thin, suffocating. Come on, Leo, Lucas called out. His son ran out of his room, clutching his Nintendo Switch. Did you leave a note for Mom? Leo asked innocently as he jammed his sneakers on. Like for the fridge? Lucas paused. His hand went to the inside pocket of his jacket, feeling the weight of the key to the rental house in Seattle. I left something better than a note, buddy. I left everything she needs to know. He ushered them out the door. The heavy oak door clicked shut with a definitive mechanical thud. Lucas didn't look back. He didn't lock it. There was no point in protecting a house that was no longer a home. As the SUV merged onto the I-90 west, leaving the Chicago skyline behind in a haze of gray smog, Lucas felt the knot in his chest loosen. He gripped the steering wheel, the leather warm under his palms. He sent one final text to Arthur Vance. It's done? File it? Then he removed the SIM card from his phone and dropped it into the cup holder. At 5:15 p.m., the sun was beginning to dip, casting long, bruised shadows across the living room floor. The front door opened. Elena breezed in, humming a tune, carrying a brown paper bag from Mark's favorite Italian deli. She was early. She had canceled her last appointment, desperate to start the freedom weekend she had fantasized about. The apartment was silent, but she expected that. She expected them to be at the airport, or perhaps already in the air. Hello, house, she whispered, kicking off her heels. She felt a thrill of illicit excitement. Tonight, Mark would come over. Not as a guest, but as a lover who didn't have to leave before dawn. She walked into the kitchen to plate the antipasto. That was when she saw it. The kitchen island was pristine, wiped clean of any clutter, except for a single thick manila envelope and a small silver USB drive resting precisely in the center. It looked clinical. Alien. Elena frowned, her steps slowing. She placed the deli bag on the counter, the crinkle of paper loud in the stillness. She reached out and picked up the envelope. It was heavy. Her name was typed on the front in formal script. She tore it open. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The words swam before her eyes. Breath hitched in her throat, a sharp, ragged sound. She flipped the page, her hands trembling violently. Custody, sole custody, financial restraining order. No, she whispered. No, no, no. She dropped the papers. They scattered across the floor like dead leaves. Her gaze snapped to the USB drive. Next to it was a small, handwritten note on a yellow, sticky pad. The only thing in Lucas's handwriting. For your viewing pleasure. I think Mark prefers the left side of the bed. I've cleared out my side. The silence of the penthouse suddenly transformed. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was predatory. Elena ran to the hallway, shouting names that no longer lived there. Sophie? Leo! She threw open the door to Leo's room. Empty. The closets were stripped bare. She ran to Sophie's room, empty. Even the pictures on the dresser were gone. She scrambled back to the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She grabbed her phone to call Lucas, but her fingers were shaking so hard she dropped it. When she finally dialed, the line went straight to a dead tone. Not voicemail. Nothing. She called Mark. He answered on the second ring, his voice low and husky. Hey, beautiful. Is the coast clear? He knows, Elena choked out, sliding down the kitchen cabinet until she hit the cold floor, surrounded by the legal wreckage of her life. Mark, he took them. He took the kids. He knows everything. The silence on the other end was deafening. Mark, what do you mean he knows? Mark's voice had lost all its warmth. It was sharp, panicked. What kind of proof does he have, Elena? Elena looked at the silver USB drive gleaming under the pendant lights. Everything, she whispered. He has everything. The silence in the penthouse was different now. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a well-ordered home. It was the heavy, dusty silence of a museum after hours. 3 months had passed since the door clicked shut behind Lucas, and in that time, the legal machinery he had set in motion had crushed Elena with terrifying efficiency. Arthur Vance had been ruthless. The temporary custody order was granted to Lucas based on moral instability and the psychological impact of the maternal environment. Elena was allowed supervised video calls twice a week. That was it. She was a visitor in her children's lives, a pixelated face on a screen buffering through a bad connection in Seattle. Elena stood in the master bedroom, holding a glass of Chardonnay that had grown warm in her hand. Mark was in the shower. The sound of the water running used to thrill her. It meant he was sneaking a wash before rushing home to his own life. Now, it just meant the water bill was going up. Mark walked out, a towel wrapped loosely around his waist, steam billowing behind him. He didn't look like the forbidden prize anymore. He looked tired. His skin was sallow, the stress of the scandal at his law firm etching deep lines around his mouth. The partners had not taken kindly to the exposure of his misuse of company cards. He was on probation. His partnership track derailed. They're threatening to audit my expenses going back 5 years, Mark muttered, tossing the wet towel onto the chaise longue. Lucas never did that. Lucas always hung the towel up. Vance is bleeding me dry, Elena. You need to settle. I can't settle, Elena said, her voice brittle. He has Sophie and Leo. I'm not signing away my rights just because you're worried about your bonus. Mark stopped drying his hair and looked at her. The charm that had seduced her, The attentive gaze that made her feel like the center of the universe was gone. In its place was a look of dull irritation. "We wouldn't be in this mess if you hadn't left your phone on the counter," Mark snapped, moving to the closet, Lucas's closet. He pulled out a shirt that hung awkwardly on him. Nothing fit right here. The architecture of the room rejected him. "We?" Elena laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "You were the one who said we were soulmates. You said Lucas didn't understand me. You said we deserved to be happy." "We are happy," Mark said automatically, buttoning his shirt with aggressive movements. "We're free. Isn't that what we wanted? No more hiding." Elena looked around the room. Yes, they were free. Free to endure the whispers at the country club that had suddenly stopped sending invitations. Free to eat takeout on the couch because neither of them knew how to cook the way Lucas did. Free to sleep in a bed that felt too big, too cold, and haunted by the ghost of a better man. "I called Sophie today," Elena whispered, looking down at her wine. She didn't answer. She texted back an hour later. "In class. Can't talk." "She's a teenager, Elena. They're moody." "She's not moody. She's gone." Mark sighed, the sound of a man bored with a problem he couldn't bill for. "Look, I have to go into the office. Damage control, don't wait up." He kissed her on the cheek. It was a perfunctory peck, devoid of passion, the kind of kiss a husband gives a wife he has grown tired of. The irony hit Elena like a physical blow. They had destroyed 2 marriages to escape the boredom of domesticity, only to crash land immediately into a worse version of it. The front door slammed. Elena was alone again. She walked into the living room and sat on the white sofa. The sun was setting over the lake, painting the room in shades of dying amber. She remembered the dinner parties they used to host here. Lucas managing the guests with effortless grace, the children running around in pajamas before bed, the feeling of being safe, protected, admired. She looked at the empty space on the wall where a family portrait used to hang. Lucas had taken it. "We won," she whispered to the empty room, tears finally spilling over, hot and stinging. "We won, and I have nothing." 5 years is enough time for a city to change its skyline, for a child to grow into a stranger, and for a passionate love affair to rot from the inside out. In Seattle, the rain was a gentle, rhythmic constant against the glass walls of Lucas's studio. At 47, Lucas wore his age well. The gray at his temples didn't make him look old. It made him look distinguished, like a structure that had weathered a storm and stood firm. He watched Leo, now 15 and lanky, struggle with a tie in the reflection of the window. They were getting ready for a gallery opening, not Elena's, but a local artist Lucas had been supporting. "Here," Lucas said, turning around. His voice was calm, devoid of the tension that used to tighten his throat in Chicago. With practiced hands, he fixed the knot. "You look good, Leo." "Thanks, Dad," Leo mumbled, embarrassed but smiling. The house was warm, filled with the smell of brewing coffee and the easy silence of people who trust each other. 2,000 miles away, in Chicago, the silence was sharp enough to cut skin. Elena sat at the vanity table, removing her earrings. The diamond studs were a gift from Mark 2 Christmases ago, an apology for a scene he had caused at a charity gala. She looked at her reflection. She was 43, but the woman staring back looked brittle. Her eyes, once bright with the thrill of transgression, were now guarded, constantly scanning the periphery for danger. The bedroom door opened. Mark didn't knock. He never knocked anymore. He walked in, loosening his tie with a jerky, aggressive motion. The smell of scotch clung to him, a stale, sweet aura that had become his permanent cologne. His career hadn't recovered since the scandal. He was working at a mid-tier firm now, handling divorces for people who reminded him too much of himself. "You were late," Mark said. It wasn't a question. Elena didn't turn around. She continued to wipe the makeup from her face. "The board meeting ran over. I texted you." "You texted me at 7. The meeting was supposed to end at 6 cogs. That's an hour, Elena. An hour is a long time." Mark moved closer, looming over her shoulder in the mirror. His eyes were bloodshot, narrowed with a paranoia that had become his defining trait. "I was working, Mark," she said, her voice weary. "Not everyone is plotting." "Isn't that what you told Lucas?" Mark sneered, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent a shiver of revulsion down her spine. "Didn't you tell him you were just working when you were meeting me at the St. Regis?" Elena froze. This was the weapon he used every time he felt insecure. Every time the ghost of his own immorality came back to haunt him, he punished her for the very sin he had encouraged her to commit. "That was different," she said quietly. "Was it?" Mark grabbed her phone from the vanity. Elena flinched, not because she had anything to hide, but because the invasion of privacy had become a daily ritual. He scrolled through her messages, his thumb swiping aggressively. "Who is David from Logistics? Why is he texting you at 8 p.m.? "He's asking about a shipment, Mark." "Read it." Mark threw the phone back onto the table. It clattered loudly against the glass. "I know how you operate, Elena. I know how easy it is for you to lie. You're good at it. You fooled Lucas for 2 years. You think you can't fool me?" Elena turned to face him then. For a moment, she didn't see the man she had destroyed her family for. She saw a pathetic, frightened little boy trapped in a man's suit. She remembered Lucas, how he never checked her phone, never questioned her schedule, never made her feel small. She had mistaken Lucas's trust for indifference, and Mark's obsession for passion. "I'm not cheating on you, Mark," she said, her voice hollow. "I don't have the energy to lie to anyone else." Mark stared at her, his jaw working. Then, the anger seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a pathetic neediness that was even harder to stomach. He reached out to touch her hair, his hand shaking slightly. "I just love you so much," he slurred, the alcohol talking. "I can't lose you. We paid too high a price for this." Elena let him touch her, but she felt nothing. She felt like a statue. Yes, she thought, closing her eyes as his hand grazed her cheek. "We paid a price. But I'm the only one who went bankrupt." Outside, the Chicago wind howled against the penthouse windows, a lonely, desolate sound that drowned out the beating of her own heart. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, sandwiched between a utility bill and a flyer for a dental clinic. It was made of heavy, cream-colored cardstock, the kind that whispered of prestige and tuition fees. The return address was embossed in purple ink. University of Washington, Seattle. Elena stood in the foyer of the penthouse, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It had been nearly 8 years since the departure. Communication had been sparse, stilted emails on birthdays, brief text messages that felt like auto-replies. But this was physical. This was an open door. She opened it with a letter opener, careful not to tear the paper. Inside lay a formal invitation to the commencement ceremony of the class of 2032. Sophie Elizabeth Vance, magna cum laude. Elena traced the name with her fingertip. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sudden. "She invited me," she whispered to the empty hallway. "She actually invited me." She ignored the sterile nature of the invitation. There was no handwritten note tucked inside. No "Mom, please come," or "I miss you." It was identical to the invitations sent to distant aunts or family friends. But to Elena, starved of connection, it looked like an olive branch. It looked like forgiveness. "What's that?" Mark emerged from the living room, holding a tumbler of whiskey. It was barely noon. He saw the invitation in her hand and the flushed excitement on her cheeks. His expression darkened immediately. "Sophie's graduation," Elena said, her voice trembling with hope. "I have to book a flight. I need to find a hotel." "No, the hotels will be booked. Maybe an Airbnb near the campus." Mark snatched the invitation from her hand. He scanned it, his lip curling slightly. "2 tickets, one for you, one for a guest. I assume Lucas has the VIP seating in the front row." "It doesn't matter where I sit," Elena said, taking the card back defensively. "The point is, she wants me there. It's a milestone, Mark. This is my chance to fix things, to show them I'm still their mother." "You think flying to Seattle is going to undo 8 years?" Mark scoffed, walking back to the liquor cabinet. "They've built a life without you, Elena. You're just a spectator now." "Don't do that," she snapped. "Don't poison this for me." "I'm just being realistic. I'm coming with you." Elena froze. "What?" "No. Mark, this is about Sophie. You and she, it's complicated. It might be better if I go alone." Mark slammed his glass down. The sound echoed violently in the open space. "Complicated? I'm your husband. We've been together for years. If you're going back to face him, I am not letting you go alone. I'm not going to let Lucas look down on you, on us, like we're some dirty secret." Elena looked at him. She saw the fear behind his aggression. He wasn't going to support her. He was going to mark his territory. He was terrified that if she saw Lucas again, successful, stable, architectural Lucas, she would realize exactly what she had traded away. "Fine," Elena said quietly, defeated. "You can come. But you have to promise to be civil." The next 3 days were a blur of manic preparation. Elena spent hours in the high-end boutiques of Michigan Avenue. She wasn't just shopping for a dress. She was shopping for an identity. She couldn't look desperate. She couldn't look like the evil ex-wife from a soap opera. She needed to look successful, happy, and maternal. She chose a pale blue silk dress. It was elegant, understated, and terrifyingly expensive. Standing in the fitting room, she smoothed the fabric over her hips. She looked good. She looked like a woman who had it all together. "When Sophie sees me," Elena thought, staring into the mirror, "she'll remember. She'll remember the bedtime stories and the cookies and the trips to the zoo. She'll see that I'm still her mom." She packed her suitcase with the precision of a soldier going to war. She packed the dress. She packed a gift, a vintage necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, something she had saved for this exact moment. In her mind, the reunion played out like a movie scene. Sophie would spot her in the crowd. Her eyes would widen. She would run over, abandoning the formality of the ceremony. "Mom, you came." They would hug. Lucas would nod from a distance, acknowledging her effort. Mark would stand by her side, proving that their love was valid, that the destruction of the family had been worth something. It was a beautiful fantasy. It was the only thing keeping her upright as she boarded the plane to Seattle, unaware that she was flying straight into a mirror that would show her exactly who she had become. The drizzle over Husky Stadium was relentless, a fine mist that clung to coats and blurred the edges of the gathered crowd. The air smelled of wet pine and expensive perfume. Elena smoothed the front of her blue silk dress for the 10th time, her fingers trembling. Beside her, Mark adjusted his collar, looking around with a mix of disdain and defensiveness, like an animal sensing it had wandered into a predator's territory. "There," Elena whispered, her breath catching. She spotted them near the north entrance. Lucas was standing under a large black umbrella. He looked older, yes, but it was the kind of aging that spoke of peace rather than stress. He was laughing at something Leo, now a tall, broad-shouldered young man of 18, was saying. And Sophie. Sophie looked radiant in her purple cap and gown, clutching a bouquet of white hydrangeas. But it was the woman standing next to Lucas that made Elena's steps falter. She was tall, wearing a trench coat belted at the waist, with hair the color of autumn leaves. Her hand rested on Lucas's arm, not in a possessive grip, but with an easy, settled familiarity. As Elena watched, the woman reached up to fix a stray lock of hair under Sophie's graduation cap. Sophie didn't flinch. She leaned into the touch. "Who is that?" Mark muttered, squinting. Elena didn't answer. She felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. She walked forward, the heels she had carefully chosen sinking slightly into the damp turf. "Sophie!" Elena called out, forcing a bright, trembling smile onto her face. The group turned. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a polite, impenetrable silence. "Mom," Sophie said. She didn't run. She didn't drop her flowers to embrace her long-lost mother. She stood still, her smile fading into a mask of courteous recognition. "You made it." "Of course I made it, darling," Elena said, closing the distance. She reached out to hug her daughter. Sophie accepted the embrace, but her body was stiff, a rigid board against Elena's desperation. It was like hugging a stranger in an elevator. Elena pulled back, her eyes stinging. She looked at Lucas. He nodded at her, his expression unreadable. Not angry, not hurt, just indifferent. "Hello, Elena," Lucas said. His voice was calm, the voice of a man addressing a former colleague he barely remembered. Then he looked at Mark, his gaze hardening for a fraction of a second before dismissing him entirely. "Mark." Mark puffed out his chest. "Lucas, long time. The kid looks good." "Leo," Lucas corrected quietly. "His name is Leo." "Right. Leo." Mark smirked, trying to regain ground. "So, this is the new life? Seattle suits you. A bit wet for my taste." Nobody answered him. The silence stretched, excruciating and thick. "Oh, this is Julia," Lucas said, gesturing to the woman beside him. "My fiancée." The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. "Fiancée." "It's nice to meet you, Elena," Julia said warmly. There was no malice in her eyes, only a pitying kindness that was far worse than hatred. "Sophie talks about you occasionally." Occasionally. The word ripped through Elena. She fumbled with her purse, desperate to change the narrative to prove she mattered. I brought you something, Sophie," Elena stammered, pulling out the velvet box containing the vintage necklace. "It was Grandma's. I saved it for your graduation." Sophie took the box. She opened it, looked at the diamonds, and gave a small, tight smile. "Thank you. It's beautiful." She snapped the box shut and handed it to Julia. "Julia, can you hold this for me? My hands are full with the flowers." It was a reflex, an unconscious, brutal reflex. Sophie had handed the family heirloom to the woman she trusted, the woman she saw as her keeper. Elena felt the world tilt. She looked at the tableau before her. Lucas, Julia, Sophie, and Leo. They stood close together, a seamless unit, their body language excluding her completely. They didn't need her to complete the picture. They didn't even need her to leave. She was simply a ghost, haunting a house that had already been sold. "We should get going," Leo said, checking his watch. "The reservation at Canlis is in 40 minutes. "Right," Lucas said. He looked at Elena one last time. "Thank you for coming, Elena. It was good for Sophie to see you." He turned away. He didn't ask where she was staying. He didn't invite them to dinner. He placed his hand on Julia's back, and they walked away into the gray Seattle mist, their laughter starting up again before they were even out of earshot. Elena stood frozen in the drizzle. Mark stood beside her, for once silent, realizing that no amount of money or arrogance could buy what Lucas had just walked away with. "They didn't even ask us to join," Mark finally spat out, bitter and small. Elena didn't hear him. She was watching her daughter's figure disappear into the crowd, realizing with a shattering clarity that she hadn't just lost custody. She had been erased. The lounge at the Fairmont Olympic was dimly lit, smelling of old leather and expensive bourbon. It was the kind of place people went to hide, or to wait for flights that would take them away from their problems. Elena sat by the window, twisting the stem of her martini glass, watching the condensation pool on the coaster. Across the small round table, Mark was already on his third scotch. He had loosened his tie, his face flushed with a mixture of alcohol and indignation. "The arrogance," Mark muttered, swirling the amber liquid. "Did you see the way he looked at me? Like I was the hired help. And that woman, Julia, probably some gold digger he picked up to play mommy." Elena didn't answer. The sound of Mark's voice, once the soundtrack to her most thrilling fantasies, now grated on her nerves like a rusty hinge. She wasn't thinking about Mark. She was thinking about the way Sophie had looked when she handed the velvet box to Julia. It wasn't done with malice. It was done with instinct. That was what hurt the most. Malice requires effort. Instinct is truth. "They're probably at some pretentious restaurant right now," Mark continued, his bitterness spilling over, "laughing at us, thinking they're better than us just because they play house in the suburbs." "Stop it, Mark," Elena said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the low hum of the bar. Mark paused, glass halfway to his mouth. "What?" "They aren't laughing at us," Elena said, turning her gaze from the rain-streaked window to look him in the eye. "They aren't thinking about us at all." Mark scoffed, setting his glass down hard. "Don't be dramatic. Of course they are. We're the reason his life imploded. We're the villains in his little hero story." "No," Elena corrected him, feeling a cold, hollow clarity settle in her chest. "We were the villains 8 years ago. Now, we're just footnotes. We're anecdotes they tell to explain why they moved to Seattle." She looked at Mark, really looked at him. She saw the thinning hair, the weak chin, the perpetual victimhood masked as bravado. She had burned down a cathedral to build a shack with this man. She had traded a husband who built skyscrapers for a man who couldn't even build a bridge to his own stepchildren. "I gave up everything for you," she whispered, the realization finally solidifying into words. Dirk rolled his eyes. "Here we go, the martyr act again. I gave up plenty too, Elena. My partnership, my reputation." "You gave up a job," she said, her voice trembling. "I gave up my children. I stood there today, Mark, and I realized I don't have a daughter anymore. I have a polite acquaintance named Sophie." She stood up. The movement was sudden, jarring. "Where are you going?" Mark asked, annoyed. "We haven't ordered dinner." I'm not hungry. Elena walked out of the lounge, leaving him there with his scotch and his grievances. She walked through the opulent lobby and out into the cool Seattle night. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and reflecting the city lights. Somewhere in this city, in a warm, light-filled room, Lucas was making a toast. Julia was probably laughing, her hand resting on Sophie's shoulder. Leo was probably teasing his sister. They were a family, a complete sealed circle. Elena wrapped her coat tighter around herself, shivering not from the cold, but from the vast, echoing silence inside her. She had thought the affair was an escape from a mundane life. She realized now that the mundane life, the shared coffees, the school runs, the quiet evenings on the couch, was the only thing that had ever been real. She looked up at the Space Needle, glowing white against the dark sky. It looked like a beacon, but she knew it wasn't for her. She was a tourist in her children's lives. She would fly back to Chicago tomorrow, back to the penthouse that felt like a museum, back to Mark and his bitterness, back to the bed she had made. The tragedy wasn't that she was alone. The tragedy was that she was exactly where she had chosen to be. Elena took a breath, tasting the damp, foreign air, and walked into the darkness, the echo of her own footsteps, the only sound following her home.